Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Am I too loud? Good afternoon. Sorry. On behalf of the Friends of the Harriet Beecher Stowe House, we respectfully acknowledge that the ground on which we stand are traditional Miami and Shawnee lands. We extend our esteem and gratitude to the indigenous people who call this place home. Welcome to the Harriet Beecher Stowe House lecture series here in person and online. I'm Christina Hartley, the Executive Director at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House. Our sponsors for the 2023 lecture series are longtime Friends member Alan Bernard, the Friends of Harriet Beecher Stowe House Board, and the First Unitarian Church, where we are here in person. We thank them for all of their support. Thanks also to our volunteers and board members who are running the AV equipment and who checked you in. Members of the Friends of Harriet Beecher Stowe House enjoy these programs without an extra charge. So if you are not a member yet, we do have information on becoming a member at the front table. You can talk to the ladies out there. We'll have the presentation first and then a question and answer time. Yes, I thought so. Today's presenter is Dr. Cheli Reutter, UC Professor of American Literature and Medical Humanities. Many of her courses include a service learning component and community engagement. She is also a member of the board of the Friends of Harriet Beecher Stowe House. So now, Stowe's The Pearl of Orr's Island, a novel of passing and transatlantic treasure.
All right, so thank you very much. And as I get settled in here, I just really want to thank Christina Hartley for bringing Harriet along. I really wanted Harriet to be here, so thank you. Thank you for coming, and thank you for listening online as well. The Pearl of Orr's Island, novel of passing and transatlantic treasure. A baby washed up onto shore. Fiercely protective town gossips, a sea captain and a pirate, a pastor with a secret past, a young woman dying of consumption, love triangles and taboos. This is the stuff of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Pearl of Orr's Island, a story of coastal Maine, published serially in 1861 and 1862. It is likely that until recently, you have never heard of this novel, or that you recognize the title only. Despite the fame of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and despite the name of Harriet Beecher Stowe, the writer to whom Lincoln's apocryphal quote, "The little woman who wrote the book that started this great war," is attributed. And yet, I believe this is a literary gem we should not forget. I do not argue that it is perfect, aesthetically or politically for that matter, but I suggest that its storytelling and literary qualities are remarkable, and that, surprisingly, given its title and what you might expect if you have heard talk of Stowe's society novels, it provokes an interesting conversation concerning the northern and westernmost leg of what Paul Gilroy calls the Black Atlantic, that triangular trade between the Americas, Europe, and Africa, of sugar, cotton, tobacco, gold, spices, and of human beings. And it offers a different story about coastal New England than we might expect to hear. In coastal Maine, amidst seafarers, fishermen, community aunts, and a pragmatic New England housewifery which teaches its daughters the rigid discipline of turning sheets, we discover the long shadow of slavocracy and the Middle Passage, biblical typology, Shakespearean allusion, Gothic story, and island romance. We smash a ship, drown a few loved ones, rest a baptismal font on top of a coffin, rock an invisible baby in a cradle, and send a skiff with 3 young children in it out into shark-infested waters. If this sounds like your cup of tea, or as I might say, your glass of beer, since even the elderly Mary Pennell brews her own, you should travel down the road to Kennebec with me and settle in at the Pearl House as the still standing prototype, unassumingly situated as it is on Johnson's Point Road on Orr's Island, and stay with me for a while. If you are here for exotic tales and pirate stories, for gothic settings, incestuous love, and uncanny adventures, you are most warmly welcomed. In this journey to Orr's Island, I offer a history and biography, and a personal story, and a literary analysis. It is very likely that you came to know Stowe in the same way most of us did, through her bestseller, and that you know just how incredibly influential Stowe was in her own time, beginning with the serial release of Uncle Tom's Cabin in the National Era from June of 1851 to April of 1852. You probably also know that while Uncle Tom's Cabin has had ebbs and flows in popularity and has even inspired a vastly different sort of critique in the 20th century, it has never gone out of print in the 170 years since its publication. You also may know about the 300,000 copies of the collected edition sold by the end of 1852, or that this was the first American novel in over 60 years to eclipse the popularity of Susanna Rowson's sentimental novel, Charlotte Temple. You may even know about the flurry of activities in Stowe's own life in response to the desirable and undesirable attention she received after Uncle Tom's Cabin appeared. Desirable in terms of financial support for a struggling family, and desirable in terms of its influence in debates about American slaveocracy, but undesirable because of the intense backlash against these same polemics and against Stowe herself. The author, as you may or may not know, was subject to defamation and even terroristic threats. Meanwhile, Uncle Tom's Cabin was quickly banned in most southern states under the pretense that it was utterly false in its argument that slavery was an immoral system. But you may not know that even in the 1850s, she was imagining a return to a very different sort of writing. And I'm just gonna do a mic check for a second. Am I getting too much feedback? Okay. So in the years immediately following the release of Uncle Tom's Cabin, Stowe responded with her Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, her Dread or the Tale of a Swamp, and other anti-slavery efforts. In the midst of these, Stowe herself became a transatlantic treasure, traveling to England, where she was a wildly popular celebrity whose accompanying brother Charles or her husband Calvin stood by to protect her very safety from adoring fans on the streets. Even while, for her engagements, she was expected to sit quietly, sometimes in another room, while one of them read her work. What you might not know is that Stowe's writings ranged wildly in nature, genre, and arguably quality, from her beginnings as a writer in the mid-1830s until shortly before her death. What you also might not know is at the time of the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, as well as A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin a few years later, she was no longer living in Cincinnati. She had recently moved to Brunswick, Maine, where her husband Calvin had been hired by his alma mater. Though she lived there only from 1850 to 1852, it was there that she was inspired and commissioned to write what would finally become her Pearl of Orr's Island. Of course, it was also there where she actually published Uncle Tom's Cabin. As greater Cincinnatians, we might have a particular appreciation or affinity for Uncle Tom's Cabin because it is our local tale. Even as it has been translated into at least 70 languages, we can recognize and may have visited landmarks for the novel. We've looked over the Howe River at Ripley and imagined what it would have been like for the real-life prototype of Eliza to attempt the terrifying crossing while holding tightly to a child. Maybe we have been to our own Stowe house. I hope you have. Please come, please, if you haven't already. Maybe we have been to our own Stowe house, Cincinnati, and seen a manuscript in the handwriting of Stowe from her Cincinnati years. We might have seen curated displays there as well, including If These Walls Could Talk. Or we might have imagined Theodore Weld in the Lane Revels in the parlor of the Stowe house, with our own Hattie as witness. Her experiences in Brunswick and Harpswell and other sites in Cumberland County, Maine, while her husband was a professor at Bowdoin, seem, by contrast, to be apolitical in nature, and one might predict her writing on the region to reflect that. But though in her animal stories and even in tales like the Dickensian Poganuc people, we do see a showcasing of an author who can provide simple local color or just plain fun, Stowe does address serious political and economic issues in her story of coastal Maine. But I'm getting ahead of myself, as before I dig in, I would like to provide a bit of my own story and my own journey to Orr's Island. So I'm a literature professor at the University of Cincinnati, and I have read and written about the Pearl of Orr's Island before, back when I was much younger and way not as smart. I am also on the board of the Harriet Beecher Stowe House, Cincinnati, a position I value because of its mission to develop the legacy of Stowe and her family, and to continue to make space for conversations about racial and social justice in Cincinnati, and particularly in Walnut Hills, where Stowe lived for about 18 years. But it's been more than 15 years since my article, Novel of Passing and Cultural Gem, came out in college English, and neither my courses nor my current scholarship includes Stowe. Shouldn't confess that. But as I now mostly work in the 20th century, still I am drawn to Stowe and to Pearl in particular. For me, the road to Orr's Island started, as it did for so many of us, with Uncle Tom's Cabin. I read the book for my first time my junior year of college at Rice University, an American Renaissance class taught by Professor Scott Derrick. I was a two-time quitter, having left the Eastman School of Music because I did not want to practice that much, and St. John's College because I realized that I liked good books a whole lot more than great books. Yes. Scott Derrick's class was in my first term at Rice, about 1 million years ago, but I remember it distinctively, as I also remember reading Moby Dick, The Scarlet Letter, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, essays by Emerson, Walden, and Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. It was in that class that I realized I wanted to become an English professor, at the exact moment when Professor Derrick tripped over the classroom garbage can in his ambulatory excitement over a particular scene in Moby Dick. This was the class where I learned about the development of the beliefs, polemics, and activism around issues of race and gender in the 19th century US. And it was also the class where I learned the complexity of these activities. For example, understanding that being anti-slavery and pro-abolitionist did not necessarily mean being devoid of pernicious racial stereotyping, nor could you necessarily credit this position to anything like what we in today's language call anti-racism. I discovered that sometimes within the same text, dealing with these complexities and intersections and the fierce arguments, I realized that someone like Stowe and even Nathaniel Hawthorne could either be called feminist or not feminist at all. I had never lived in Cincinnati at this point. Sorry, hate to admit it, I'm not really from here. Having been raised in Detroit and spent my young adult years in various non-Midwestern states. But my mother grew up in Clifton, and I had spent many a summer afternoon at Burnett Woods or Eden Park during my visits to my grandmother. Even back in 1991, I was drawn to learning more about the work and legacy of this writer, so connected to the city my mother grew up in. By the time I read Uncle Tom's Cabin, my grandmother had just recently passed away, but a few of my sisters, lived in her home over near Mount Store Park. And I felt especially close to Cincinnati and the little lady who had taken up residence there 150 years earlier. While completing my undergraduate degree with a double major in music and English, after all, I did practice enough to get that degree at least, I no doubt spent a lot more time reading dusty copies of Stowe and a lot less time to listening to recordings of Renaissance music than I should have. By the time I began my doctoral work in American literature at the University of California, Riverside in 1997, I had a very different context for Stowe as a 19th century writer. In my master's here in Cincinnati, I mostly read turn of the century and 20th century texts, including the entire corpus of Stowe's young friend and neighbor in Hartford, Samuel Clemens, aka Mark Twain. It was obvious to me where the younger writer had picked up his sense of humor. Prior to and during my doctoral program in Riverside, I read a lot of African American writers from the latter 19th and 20th century, including Francis Harper and Charles Chestnut, and eventually decided to pursue a dissertation on less canonical writers in the gap between recognized American Romantic writers and American realism. I looked at the active role they played in simultaneously addressing the race and gender politics of the time and shaping our literary tradition in ways the Academy has not properly recognized, even as William D. Howells would have it, the natural, honest, and true grasshopper had come along to replace the good old romantic cardboard grasshopper. Not so fast, William. The dissertation was called The Great Divide in the Middle Passage, but in my mind it was always My Three Harriets, because of the prominence of Harriet Wilson, Harriet Jacobs, and of course, Harriet Beecher Stowe, as well as Francis Harper and Paul Laurence Dunbar. But in the late 90s and early 2000s, a strong affinity for Harriet Beecher Stowe was awkward, that I ended up moving to Kentucky in 2000 prior to completing either my qualifying exams or dissertation for family reasons. Probably does not help my case here. While I considered my work on Stowe a recontextualization of both the author and the American literary tradition, I understood the value of African American commentaries on Stowe. I was no Gary Young, who complained in The Guardian about the Uncle Tom phenomenon, saying, Uncle Tom is whoever you want him to be, arbitrary in application. Who decides who is an Uncle Tom, and on what basis? And this is prohibitive in nature. It exemplifies the very limits of race thinking, even though it is an insult that falls most readily from lips of self-avowed radicals. It is in fact a reactionary form of psychological and behavioral racial policing. So I wasn't going to go there, but certainly placing Stowe side by side with Harriet Jacobs was awkward enough, and here's why I'm about to tell you. As early as the 1980s, Richard Yarborough quoted Langston Hughes talking about how cussed and discussed Uncle Tom's Cabin was. The former due to racial stereotyping of certain characters like Sambo and Quimbo. As a doctoral student, I read this article as well as James Baldwin's Price of a Ticket, in which he denounces the shallowness of the protest novel in general and Uncle Tom's Cabin in particular because of its trivializing and sentimentality. These articles, and even the reference to Hughes, were necessary reminders about the value of point of view and the problem of a lack of what Kevin Quashie calls quietude and what Toni Morrison calls interiority within Black characters. A generation later, Leland Person sorted out aspects of Stowe's treatment of racial topics by drawing a line directly from her to the 20th century presumptive one-book wonder Harper Lee. I see you, Professor Hennessy. Person examines the foibles of Stowe's and Lee's white characters, including St. Clair and Atticus Finch, whose desire simply to feel right rather than taking a true anti-racist position carried with it its own dangers. the chief of which is that a white mainstream audience is content to think that all the good hard work on race equity has already been done, even as inequities and injustices still flourish before our eyes. The criticism is not wrong, but the Stowe I wanted to learn how to read was the Stowe who could be approached in terms of both race and gender relations at the intersections of the two, and when possible, in association with those who claimed association with her. For one, both Frances Harper and Paul Laurence Dunbar do so, claiming this connection, alluding to her or directly naming her in works such as Eliza and Aunt Chloe's Politics, and in the case of Dunbar, a poem called Harriet Beecher Stowe. In this sense, the pairing of the Harriets was necessary. Now I'm going back to talk about Harriet Jacobs as well as Harriet Beecher Stowe. This was necessary, even though the knowledge involved something embarrassing for Harriet. Sorry. Well, maybe you need to hear this. Maybe you've had some time to reflect on what you did, Harriet. So, all right, so even with the knowledge that Harriet Beecher Stowe botched an opportunity to serve as Harriet Jacobs' editor, due, as John Getz suggests, to either misplaced suspicion of plagiarism, that somehow Harriet Jacobs' own experience in the crawl space below the house was actually a plagiarism of Cassie and the ghostly haunting, as you guys probably remember from Uncle Tom's Cabin. So maybe she thought that Harriet Jacobs was actually plagiarizing. Maybe it was because of overextension of commitment, or maybe it's even, as Joan Hedrick suggests, insensitivity due to skin privilege. So I'm going to stop just for a second, add on the little part that she, instead of responding directly to Amy Post, who wrote her, and to Harriet Jacobs herself, she instead responded to Cornelia Willis, who was the white lady who was actually called Mrs. Bruce in Harriet Jacobs' incidents in the life of Slave Girl, but she reached out to Cornelia Willis instead, and so it just sort of went downhill from there. So I will not attempt to be an apologist for Stowe in this case, in her relationship with Harriet Jacobs, or really in the lack of relationship with Black storytellers in general, beyond the enslaved man she aided while living in Maine. I will, however, suggest she did not move forward. I will, however, suggest that she moved forward instead to write a story that was authentically hers to tell. While incidents in the life of a slave girl is of a political and reflective nature we might now be likely to call also autoethnography, and while it is unparalleled in the sophistication of its arguments, Stowe's Pearl text is also much more sophisticated than we might have realized. For Stowe, Pearl is the text that comes closest in its authenticity and its embrace of the author's own subject position in a fully rendered story treating both gender and race. Both stories appear in 1861. Harriet Jacobs, after 3 years struggling to find a publisher, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, after about the same amount of time, after putting her publisher off more than once as she struggled with overcommitment to writing projects, including The Minister's Wooing in 1959, even as she ventured to Europe for the last time and enjoyed the company of her friends Ruskin and the Brownings, and even as she insisted on pushing through her European novel Agnes of Sorrento before releasing her promised New England novel. But I relate to Stowe's own experience of delayed gratification. over the past month or so of reading, rereading, and reflecting on the Pearl text and its scholarship, I've also had the amazing good fortune to go to the very island on which this novel of passing and cultural gem is set. And I'm going to reach for a moment to out to our slides and ask for the reveal of the first large map. And as you are doing so, I'm going to explain to you that this opportunity came up literally last minute. I came back from, there it is. I came back from Boston only yesterday. I had a very whirlwind tour from Wednesday until yesterday, and it changed a lot. And unfortunately, I will say I took some really great pictures of Pearl of Orr's Island, of Orr's Island, of the Pearl House, and of Brunswick and Bowdoin College. I have not gotten them into the slides yet. You all are welcome to say after, and I will share pictures. I know some of you in the audience will, also have pictures that you all were trotting out. So, but I do instead have some maps that I think would really want a chance to sort of graft you on before we start here. So this very first image, and I can actually look forward instead of backwards, but this very first image just really gives us this spread there. You can see on the very left side there, you have the mitten of Michigan and Detroit, and then coming up the coast, coming up to the top right a little bit, and you all can probably sort of sketch out the top of Maine there. But Orr's Island is located in the southernmost part of Maine. So if you can look down a little, we'll get a close-up coming up. So if we can get to the next slide, please. And this is really sort of a cutout, mostly of the Cumberland County area. And as you can see there, the white stuff on the top that you're looking at, that's actually Brunswick on the very top, the city of Brunswick. And then if you go directly down coast from that, then you go into the Harpswell area, which includes the Great Island, Orr's Island, and Bailey Island. And we can go to the next slide, please, so we can get a little bit better of a look. I think that's a better image here. You can see, again, on pretty much top center, the bigger white area, that's Brunswick. I think going over to the smaller white area is going to be the Bath area. But if you go down from Brunswick, the sort of the longest, skinniest finger right from right, going straight down and curving over to, let's see, trying to get my directional bearings, it's sort of curving over to your left there. That's going to be the three-island chain of the Great Island, Orr's Island, and Bailey's Island. And so we can move on to the next slide, please. And there it is. There is a little bit of a close-up of Orr's Island, right smack in the middle there. And if you look at that one, you can see towards the bottom there, there's sort of a little finger pointing up on your left side. And that is where the Pearl House is located. And to the next slide, please. Okay, and these are actually, these are professional photographs and or images, artistic images, artistic renderings you can see of the skiff there that would be on Bailey Island, actually, which is the very bottom-most island. And Bailey Island is extremely long and skinny with really just the main road going down through it. So the next slide, please. Yes, and that guy, that fisherman guy he's giant in person, by the way. I thought he was going to be life-size, but he's probably 3 times life-size. So just for a little perspective, he's at the very end of Bailey's Island, the very southernmost end of Bailey Island, excuse me, and there's a story on Bailey Island that I can tell at the end, but he's on the very southernmost tip of Bailey Island, looking out from the general store. And if you're looking southward and seeing him and looking across at that very small island there, there is no road that goes there. So you really have to get across it in a boat. There are a few houses, as you can see, interestingly enough. So next slide, please. Okay, and so that was, this last photograph is also taken by Mimi Stedman. All of these are supplied either by Mimi Stedman or her husband. And in this one here, you can actually see the bridge connecting Bailey Island to Orr's Island. So where the Great Island and Orr's Island are so close that you don't even know that you're on an island. Both of them are close enough to the shore or to each other that you don't really know. When you cross over onto Bailey Island, you get to do the really scary bridge with lanes that are this narrow. It is 2 ways at least, but yeah, not something I would want to traverse in the winter. So all right, and next slide, please. I threw that in for fun here, you guys. So the Eric Latimer, yeah, we're still writing about coastal Maine, but mainly pirate stories. So there it is, the 2014 Pirates of Coastal Maine. Yes, pirates really were a thing. That's gonna be our next step. We're getting into the actual close reading. So next slide, please. All right, and that's a postcard of the Pearl House right there on Orr's Island. And the next one. And we have, this is not the Pearl House, but this is an often featured one. We see it on a couple of Stowe's cover designs for Harriet Beecher Stowe. This is actually closer to the end of the island, but just thought it was really lovely to show you. Gives you a good impression of what the island looks like. And next slide, please. And then a couple more, we've seen a couple of different versions of it coming out. So really, when it was rediscovered, unlike Uncle Tom's Cabin, the Pearl of Orr's Island did go out of print for a long time, and basically it came out in 2 editions. Now it's got a ton of availability through digital copies and this and that. But first in 1980 with Bruce Kirkham, and then with Joan Hedrick. But these are, a couple of these are more recent cover designs for Orr's Island. Next slide, please. And that one I just thought was really just a very cool rendition. But the next slide, please. This one was the Bruce Kirkham edition that came out in 1980. It's not what I would have chosen, but you'll sort of understand that as you read. Next one, please. And that one is the Joan Hedrick edition. And Joan Hedrick really rediscovered discovered Harriet Beecher Stowe in a respectful way, respectful of the depth of the work, or the depth of the quality of Pearl of Orr's Island. And it was really part of a feminist rediscovery effort where other books by American women writers were being written about. But even that eventually receded, but that's sort of pride of place for that. So I think that's the end of the line of the slides, right? We might try to see it. Yep, okay. And then I would just ask that, yeah, that's perfect. That sounds very good to me. So here we are now, finally, after years of looking at cover photos and stuff, I got to go. Going to Orr's Island meant having the luxury to see the stormy coastal landscapes of Harpswell and Orr's Island, and even the topography of Devil's Back, which is a specific sort of mountainous and sort of covey, crevicey kind of area on the northern part of Orr's Island. I was luxuriating in turn of phrase, singing lines, humorous story, and even ridiculously romantic description. For me, though, it was also about having a new responsibility of carrying us back to the forgotten stories of Harriet Beecher Stowe. As Stowe herself says when describing the Pearl of Orr's Island, the story which is set in the own somewhat unspecific and distant past, although we do know that it was just after the Jefferson trade embargo, she says, there were not many lighthouses back then. But metaphorically, there have not been many since then either to shine a light through the fog. As Joanne Gardner points out in her 21 article in the Harpswell Journal called Whatever Happened to Pearl of Orr's Island, part of how the Pearl was lost involved haunting experiences, which inflect her text with a mournful quality, even as they take us to a beautifully well-written story. But another part of Whatever Happened to Pearl of Orr's Island was scholarly dismissal. As early as 1862, here it is, the Review of the Atlantic, The author complains about the men in her story, saying, "They are all unworthy of the women they love, and the early death of Mara in this novel, though very pathetic, is felt by every male reader to be better than a long married life with Moses. The latter is made happy in the end with Sally Kittredge. Mrs. Stowe does not seem conscious of the intense and bitter irony of the last scenes. Oh, but she was. She conveys the misanthropy of Swift without feeling or knowing it." If there may be some humor to this misogynist protest, Bruce Kirkham himself claims in 1980 in the aforementioned Colby Literary Quarterly that it has long been obvious to the readers of The Pearl that it is more than one way's two separate books. Part one is essentially a local color tale of quaint folks and their ways on the coast of Maine. Part two is a sentimental Christian romance, which happens to take place in New England. In part two, Mrs. Stowe's creative powers are weaker. She is less certain of herself, her topic, and her characters. The biographical background explains why she wished to be somewhere else, and the textual evidence suggests, through its indication of her indecision, how much she wanted to be there. She tinkered with the story, trying to make it better, and failed. Sarah Orne Jewett's verdict must be final. The Pearl of Orr's Island has a divine touch here and there, but is an incomplete piece of work. This couldn't be further from the truth. Fortunately, neither Kirkham nor Sarah Orne Jewett is the last word on Stowe's Pearl of Island, though. Judith Federley and Joan Hedrick have written about the novel, including the reissue with an introduction by Hedrick. Both have been interested in Stowe as a feminist writer, but after this feminist rediscovery moment, scholarly interest in the novel has once again receded. Even the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center in Hartford, Connecticut, where the author took up residence from 1870 to her death in 1896, does not mention the novel specifically. My own interest is to do justice to a text rich in both literary quality and cultural history. It is, after all, as two of my colleagues whom I have just discovered actually read Pearl say, it is the most gorgeous and most well-written among her texts, and this for a talented woman. So, one more. The story begins with an elegantly clad but frail, dark-haired, dark-eyed 22-year-old beauty riding out on the road to Kennebec with her weather-beaten, blue-eyed fisherman father in a one-horse wagon to meet her dark and dashing seafaring husband. But then, before their eyes, and this is a quote, the ship rose on a great wave clear out of the water, and the next second seemed to leap with a desperate plunge into the narrow channel. For a moment, there was a desperate shivering of the mast and the rigging, and she went down and was gone. At that moment, Naomi Lincoln, daughter of Zephaniah and Mary Pennell, and expectant mother of our novel's heroine, Mara, faints with grief. She has seen in an instant what is to become of her beloved husband, James, and all the rest, for as Stowe tells it, the story of a wreck of a homebound ship just entering the harbor is yet told in many a family on this coast. A few hours after, the unfortunate crew were washed ashore in all their joyous holiday rig, in which they had attired themselves that morning to go to their sisters, their wives, and their mothers. This, Stowe tells us, is the first scene of the story. The second is in the best room of the Pennell home, where we see the body of their son-in-law in splendid manhood laid out on a table in a broadcloth suit, a white vest, and a smart blue necktie. In the apartment upstairs are two gossips, whom we will learn are Aunt Roxy and Aunt Ruey, again to quote, no one's aunts in particular, but caregivers of the town. Also in the room are Zephaniah and Mary Pennell, a doctor, and Naomi Pennell, who delivers a baby girl and passes away, whispering, "Call her not Naomi, call her Mara, for the Lord hath dealt very bitterly with me." As the scene fades, we hear Aunt Roxy say to her younger sister, "She'll make a beautiful corpse." As one may predict, the next scene involves one of the amusements of New England. First, we get the backstory, that is a funeral. First, we get the backstory of Zephaniah Pennell, who, after the birth of his daughter Naomi, convinces his wife to let himself sell his rig, instead get a little farm and a fishing smack on Orr's Island, because, as he tells her, "The Lord has given us this pearl of great price, and that is enough." In the next few chapters, we get to know the sprightly Sally Kittredge, a little older than Mara, the youngest child and only daughter of Captain Kittredge, and being raised with all the tough love her mother has no problem mustering, while Mara, now referring to her now a sort of decoration, is treated with great care. She is a pearl washed ashore by the almighty uprooting tempest. But she's lonely, and she likes Sally and the captain, and so she often goes for visits to her more confident friend's home. In these first few gorgeously written, if melodramatic scenes, we meet most of our major characters and also come to understand the fabric on which this tale is being woven. A strong New England seafaring flavor characterizes the tale, but so too does the specter of New England piety, as her father's eye had never beheld her, and her mother's baptismal cup had rested on her mother's coffin. But in this tale, beginning in chapter 6, we see the supernatural hauntings of various kinds, including the hauntings of historical romance and the moral ambiguity of the Gothic. There is, it must be told, the story of the rocking chair, of the rocking cradle, in which no baby nor mother presides. Still, after the rocking cradle is destroyed because it disturbs the aunts of the town, a baby is heard crying and wailing from the wall. In the early and mid-19th century, quiet and misty coastal Maine was not an impoverished fishing community, but rather a thriving seafaring region with trade routes in the Americas, Europe, and Asia. In 1807, the U.S. Congress passed the act to prohibit the importation of slaves. Maine, then part of Massachusetts, had already abolished slavery in 1783, being one of the first states to do so. Coastal Maine's participation in the Black Atlantic, in the sense of direct engagement in human trafficking of African people in the Middle Passage, was thus theoretically limited even before this act. But when a Spanish-looking youngster washes up on the shore of Orr's Island in his even more Spanish-looking dead mother's arms, we are reminded of the ongoing commerce, at least between the U.S. and the Caribbean. We never learn exactly why or how his mother has come to coastal Maine, whether it is to accompany her abusive sea captain husband in an unsavory adventure, or to escape him and find her erstwhile lover and the probable father of her child, the now all but emotionless Reverend Theophilus Sewell. Moses' mother, whom we find out in the backstory, lived in St. Augustine, Florida, when the young Sewell arrived to serve as a tutor to her father's boys. But she is soon carried off to a large plantation in Cuba. We eventually learn of her entire story, framed as the story of the mysterious bracelet, which the infant Mara found when discovering the corpse and cradle of her soon-to-be adopted brother. The weird and haunting beauty of the descriptors in this death scene, harken back to that of Mara's own mother. If Shakespeare's Ophelia comes to your mind, you are not the only one. That Stowe could write such a description only a few years after the drowning of her own son, Henry Ellis, a 19-year-old college student at Dartmouth, in the Connecticut River, is confounding to the modern sensibility. If the story reaches back in literary tradition, it also reaches forward and across. We learn later in the Pearl story, with the disclosure of a letter from Reverend Sewell to Moses, now in his early adulthood, about time, that the minister gave this bracelet to Dolores in a passionate encounter before she was forced to marry the Cuban Captain Mendoza. We may think of equally dramatic revelations, for example, in an epistolary novel from Stowe's own recent memory, that would have been Frances Burney's Evelina. Then, of course, the passionate nature of their forbidden love no doubt strikes a chord familiar from Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter, just as does the drowning of Dolores dials up his blithe-veiled romance. Just before the exchange between Dolores' greedy gambling father and the ugly and lustful Mendoza in a transaction that resembles the sale of chattel, and in a moment in which the young lovers are both in fear of their lives, we read of their few hours of delirium. The only other person who loved the allegorically named Dolores, meaning sorrow, is her, quote, faithful Negro servant, who may, in fact, have been her mother. If Moses' story of being adopted by Anglo-New Englanders and even eventually becoming accepted on the island as a worthy citizen despite his Spanish appearance make this an early novel of passing, so too might Dolores' unfortunate adventures, along with those of Cassie and Eliza in Uncle Tom's Cabin, and Clotel and others in William Wells Brown's 1855 novel by the same name, develop the prototype of they develop the prototype of the tragic mulatto, which becomes much more familiar to us later in the century in works by Kate Chopin, Charles Chesnutt, Mark Twain, and Pauline Hopkins. But if, unlike the earlier novel of Passing Clotel, and like the late but mostly familiar novel Passing by Nella Larson, Moses' story has a happy ending. Yes, novels of passing usually don't. Tragic mulatto stories never do. Yet it does not come in this story even without considerable pain. We are introduced in the very first scene to Captain Zephaniah Pennell, father of Naomi Lincoln, the young bride of midshipman named James Lincoln, when the two are riding out to meet James's ship in the previously described scene. The discovery of Moses then, a few years later, is not only serendipitous, it is uncanny. And this is from Harriet Beecher Stowe's own writing. This is dream of Mara from the time she is an infant. Suddenly, there stood before them a woman dressed in long white garment. This is a dream that Mara, the very small child, has over and over. She was very pale, with sweet, serious dark eyes, and she led by the hand a black-eyed boy who seemed to be crying and looking about as if for something lost. The woman laid her hand on her head as if in blessing, and then put the boy's hand in hers, in Mara's, and said, "Take him, Mara. He is a playmate for you." And with that, the little boy's face flashed out in a merry laugh. In biblical typology, then, Mara is both Miriam and the Pharaoh princess, both the sister the familiar sister, and the one who discovers him in the basket. So much the worse for her, though, when she learns that Moses, in an open defiance of her grandparents, who has raised them with loving and effectual care, is conspiring with pirates, including the ignominious Skipper Atkinson. In Moses' defense, he harbored a trauma for which he had no language. Linguistically, when he first arrived speaking a Popish tongue, socially, in a community where he was supposed to be God-fearing and God-focused, or emotionally, in his recovery from the trauma he refuses throughout his life to speak about. But after the broody teenage Moses and his decorative flower of a little sister have a fight one evening, she follows him to the cove, unbeknownst to him, on the northernmost end of the island near Devil's Back Cove, only to overhear the skipper Atkinson demanding Moses betray Zephaniah and steal some of the coins from his sea chest. Though a fisherman in the present of the novel, Pennell has had a sea chest of his own because he had once been a sea captain, just like Kittredge. But eventually it became clear that he was too pious for the job. When he meets the little baby Naomi, we are not sure whether to presume she is actually his biological child. Mary might have been running out on him because, there she was with this little very dark-haired, dark-eyed baby. But nevertheless, he maintains the model virtue that would insist that she was his pearl. It is perhaps because of this model virtue that Mara turns not to her fisherman grandfather, but to Captain Kittredge. Kittredge confirms the wisdom of Mara's decision, explaining that even he sometimes had to deal with the likes of Skipper Atkinson. At that point, the captain goes on further to Pennell as a moral broker between biblical virtue and the politics of the Jefferson Embargo of 1807, which, according to both Stowe and Kittredge, have forced the island's men who rely on the shipping industry into moral compromise. I quote Stowe at length here. The coast of Maine, as we have elsewhere said, is remarkable for a singular interpretation of the sea, with the land forming amid its dense primeval forests, secluded bays, narrow and deep, into which vessels might float with the tide, and where they might nestle unseen and unsuspected amidst the dense shadows of the overhanging forest. And this is an exact description of what this coastal Maine looks like. The dense forest is really shadowy, often misty, over a lot of overcast days. At this time, there was a very, very brisk business done all along the coast of Maine in the way of smuggling. Small vessels, lightly built and swift to sail, would run up into these sylvan fastnesses and there make their deposits and transact their business so as to entirely elude the the vigilance of government officers. So, long story short, that the embargo of 1807 was placed because France and England were at war with each other. So, Jefferson and Congress thought it would be a good idea just to shut down American commerce altogether to avoid ruffling feathers and getting too deep into disturbing one side or the other. Of course, that was unavoidable anyhow. We ended up in the War of 1812 anyhow. But it really hurt the industry at the time, nevertheless, and just seemed like an untenable thing for along coastal Maine for them to try to practice it. It may seem strange that practices of this kind should ever have obtained a strong foothold in the community peculiar for its rigid morality and its orderly submission to law. But in this case, as in many others, contempt of law grew out of weak and unworthy legislation. This is still Stowe, not me. The celebrated embargo of Jefferson stopped at once the whole trade of New England and condemned her 1,000 ships to rot at the wharves and caused the ruin of thousands of families. The merchants of this country regarded this as a flagrant, high-handed piece of injustice, expressly designed to cripple New England commerce, and evasions of this unjust law found everywhere a degree of sympathy, even in the breast of well-disposed and conscientious people. In resistance to the law, vessels were constantly fitted out, which ran upon trading voyages to the West Indies and other places. And although the practice was punishable as smuggling, it found extensive connivance. From this beginning, I just love the language here, from this beginning, smuggling of all kinds gradually grew up in the community and gained such a foothold that even after the repeal of the embargo, it still continued to be extensively practiced. Secret depositories of contraband goods still existed in many of the lonely haunts off islands off the coast of Maine. Hid in deep forest shadows, visited only in the darkness of night, were these illegal stores of merchandise. And from these secluded resorts, they found their way, no one knew or cared to say how, into houses for miles around. Captain Kittredge convinces Pennell to navigate this water to compromise by allowing the youth, Moses, to be fitted up with a ship he can take to China himself. His ship, it should be noted, is called the Ariel at the request of Mara, who loves to read and loves The Tempest in particular. There is some considerable irony in the fact that the shipping industry, albeit a voyage to China, saves the transatlantic treasure Moses Pennell. For it is Moses, in the end, who is indeed called the Pearl of Orr's Island by Stowe herself. It may seem from the novel's protracted Christian rhetoric in 6 of the last 7 chapters that Mara's death by consumption is what saves Moses. But the very last chapter confirms at least a braided possibility of a real-world and practical love that is at least as equally the legacy New England as is the tradition of Christian piety. Sally and Moses, who before the former knew that Mara loved her brother, mercilessly and mutually played with each other's affections despite harboring no romantic feeling for one another, end up marrying one another. Stowe may have given Sally the happiest ending she could imagine for her. In contrast to the homely aunts, Roxy and Rui, the pretty and coquettish Sally is fancied by many of the island's young men, especially Tom Hires. But Sally does not care for boys, while on the other hand, Stowe strongly hints that she is in love with Mara. Moses, who assumes that his own love for Mara is unrequited because his adopted little sister is too shy to express it, was happy to toy with Sally to make Mara jealous. The jealousy stump doesn't work with Mara's nature, though, nor can she see through her brother, and it is Sally she chides when she realizes her friend does not love Moses. While the marriage between the two survivors in this love triangle may seem, in some ways, like hardly a beautiful ending, what Mara's death does afford for her best friends and the iconic representatives of the island is a beautiful and lasting friendship. For Sally and Moses write to each other across the next 4 years, during which time Moses continues to sail before deciding to settle down on the island after all. In the end, each has come to terms with the death of their beloved Mara, and we predict that their love for one another will sustain not only their own happiness, but island culture. The best way to recall what the Pearl story is really about, and this is a conclusion, is through its framing. The novel can be framed in terms of Stowe's work, life, and legacy, as we have done in this talk. It can also be framed as a Gothic story with some very interesting possibilities. It can be framed as a New England folktale, as a magical tale of the sea, as a pirate story, or for its literary allusions to Shakespeare's Tempest and many other pieces. It can be read through biblical typology, childhood adventure stories, the uncanny, as a ghost story, as a New England story, and even as a twist on the marriage plot. It can be recontextualized within feminist rediscovery efforts, examined as local color, which after all should not be a bad word, explored as a novel of passing or a traumatic or a melodic or as a tragic melodic tale. Heck, it can be considered a drinking story for all the beer and dandelion tea served therein. But mostly, I beg of you that it is a novel that should be considered.
Thank you so much. We'll do some questions and answers now. So if you're in the audience here, raise your hand and we'll bring the mic around. And if you're watching online, type your questions into the chat feature and we'll be monitoring those and can ask them as well. So, anyone Abigail, you want? Anyone questions? Yes? I'm coming over to Anne.
I'm just wondering how many of your colleagues across the country, because you have a background that spans the nation, are using this book in classes, or is it being treated academically? currently. We're in Cincinnati. We're kind of in a bubble about Harriet, so I'm just wondering what else is going on.
Yeah, that's a great question, honestly. And so I will say there is interest in Harpswell, the one 2021 article that I quoted that asked, whatever happened to the Pearl of Orr's Island. That was from the Harpswell Chronicle. I mean, they do care. So I really will get to the broader question, but I will say that I was touched on my visit when I went, first of all, how friendly the people were on Orr's Island, and I don't mean on the whole stretch. It's really hard to talk about Orr's Island without talking about the whole chain, because I think there's like exactly maybe only one business on Orr's Island itself, which I did stop at. It is called Island Candy Shop, and it's delightful, and got blackstrap molasses candy and everything. But people, I mean, they're not over the top friendly, they're not like urban Midwesterners, of which I consider myself one, like, hey, how you doing? But they will talk to you, and they're kind, and they will talk about their island. And I asked, could you tell me where the Pearl House is? And, they told me at Island Candy Company, but then another neighbor just randomly walking down the street, I asked her, and I was worried that she'd be, overwhelmed with all the tourists always asking about the Pearl House. But she was, oh, cool, she just talked to me, like, sure. And so there's clearly an interest, I think, in preserving the culture. They do regard Harriet Beecher Stowe's legacy and the fact that she wrote about them as something special. But as for the larger question that you're asking about, sort of, I think, like in the academy, whether it's taught. So I talked to two of my colleagues, and they both gave me an interesting answer. One of them is a more senior colleague, and she said, she found out about the Pearl of Orr's Island through archival research. It had not, this was before 1980, she had not, it hadn't even been reissued by Bruce Kirkham, who had been, pretty negative about it. I mean, it's like really, I'm sort of glad it survived Bruce Kirkham. I'm thankful for Joan Hedrick, honestly. I mean, but I actually, but even before that, so she was a graduate student at Yale, and like dug in their archives to find a copy of Pearl of Orr's Island. I think just went on a spree of reading Harriet Beecher Stowe. So then another colleague actually found out about it after the Joan Hedrick, who is a feminist American lit scholar, and found out about it with Joan Hedrick. So I think taught it then for a while, but I think that I know of, it's not really being taught. I went online, snooped around Goodreads and all that, and like people are reading it and reviewing it, mostly, I don't want to be a snob, but with very sort of uninformed opinions. They're like, oh, this is boring, too many words, kind of thing. So I would love a little bit more. I would like to see us teaching. It's a really, great, it's a page turner. It is, both of the colleagues who I talked to said it is, they insisted that it was the most beautiful of Stowe's novels. And they appreciated her other works, but it was the most beautifully rendered. I hope that came across in some of the quotations. So the short answer is no, it's not being taught. It wasn't taught when I was doing my own research. I had to dig for it too. But it should be. So.
I will add on to that just a little bit. Probably not a good example because she's highly intelligent and highly the best go-getter, one of the best go-getters I know. But our former intern, Emma DeMonte, did use passages and quotes from Pearls of Orr's Island in her dissertation, her undergraduate dissertation that was, comparing, kind of like looking at the use of Latin and the use of the classics by Mara, and also comparing that to the use of Latin and classics by characters in Dread. So she was looking at that kind of thing. So she's obviously read it, but she's probably not the best, not a typical example of an undergraduate.
So we have a question here from Rebecca Bora, who's been watching the live stream. She says, sounds like this is a novel ripe for rediscovery or even adaptation into another medium. Have there been any hints that it could be adapted?
Oh. Well, first of all, I'm going to take the softball from Christina and say that actually I love that Emma did that. And that is one lens. You could literally interpret this through a high literature lens, just in terms of the Greek and Latin and the literary allusion. I mean, that's one of the beauties of it, is that you can read it high or low. You can go to the ghost stories, you can go to the folk stories, you can go to Shakespeare if you want. But so hi Becky, and thanks for throwing me a hardball there. So no, I haven't heard, but what I think should be noted is that it would be really great. I think we all should take a personally, you know, I just think we should all get a tour bus and go there to the island and, you know, read passages of it, and maybe something can come out as us sort of like some sort of our own little folk thing going on, where we could like come back and talk about it and have some kind of dramatic experiences. Who knows? It's a good question though.
Okay, I'm coming back to Kelly. Here we go.
Hey, thank you for the talk. And I just wanted to kind of hop on the comment about taking a bus out to see it. You had shared that whenever you went there, you did see certain things in the novel differently. And I understood that you saw the descriptions as being accurate. And that was really fun to hear, that you were like, oh yeah, I can connect this to what I saw. But I wondered what else kind of came to you as a result of going to that place, how it changed the way that you read the book.
Oh, I could talk about that one a lot. Because, so I should tell you that in the time between Wednesday and Saturday, the little time that I had, it wasn't until Friday morning that we got to head down to Orr's Island. I came in through Boston, and Boston is a nightmare in terms of traffic and all of this. It was particularly a nightmare. But we also, so we spent a little bit of time in Boston. I really confess this very guiltily. I did Hawthorne things. And including, we drove to Salem, right, in October. Okay, so you can only imagine. But I was not there for the witch houses and the really, oh my gosh, eyeball rolling, horrible, kitschy Salem witch things. But instead, I did go to the House of Seven Gables at one point and learned a lot about Hawthorne, including, sort of this nagging question that I had, like, surely those two knew each other. And I just, but I kind of figured out, kind of pieced together the fact that Hawthorne was too much of a snob to acknowledge Stowe, quite frankly. So, there would have been a connection through Longfellow, because, when Harriet's husband went back to teach at Bowdoin College, Longfellow was there. Longfellow had graduated in the class of 1825 along with Nathaniel Hawthorne. And they even have like the Hawthorne Longfellow Library on Bowdoin College campus and all of this. But they would have lived in the very same area. After the Stowes left Bowdoin, they moved to Andover for a little while, which is also, so they were traveling really in the same vicinity. But again, Hawthorne, with all his concern over scribbling women writers, I think would have just absolutely not deigned to have met her. So that's one thing that put it in the perspective that we had this sort of, I really am answering your question indirectly here, Kelly. So, we had this whole thing with Hawthorne, and then after that, I moved away from this very busy, very happening Boston and even Salem area, and I went to Orr's Island. And it was, first of all, much smaller and much quieter than I had imagined. And it really, that was part of why I felt like time had not really changed it. I mean, most of the houses were still quite old, and it was so unassuming. And it really did also match the physical description. I guess it was both the physical description. I mean, too exactly. I was so excited to recognize, oh yeah, the Devil's Cove. I mean, you know, Stowe was very talented with writing description. But oh my gosh, there was something I could feel right here when I actually saw it. And exactly, you know, that was exactly what she was saying it was gonna look like. So yeah, that was how it was for me.
Jan has a question.
Thank you, Jan Curry. This book reminded me of Louisa May Alcott's writing, and I wondered if you made any connection to Little Women, of course. And I don't know the time that she wrote and whether there's any coincidence that they knew each other or whether times were similar. But it seemed very much a feminist novel, as Little Women was.
So thank you. I haven't brushed up on my Louisa May Alcott as I should, but I believe that Louisa May Alcott was about a generation younger than Stowe, but that, so it would have been Bronson Alcott who was in the sort of, Bronson Alcott was sort of good buddies with all the Fruitvale experiment, I think it was called, that whole thing where they went to live on a farm, you know, a bunch of writers who like were really good at writing and shouldn't have tried to be harvesting. It started to, you know, so Bronson Alcott was connected with that, and I believe, but I might be talking out of turn, that that Stowe, that there was some kind of strong connection between Stowe and Bronson Alcott, but I don't. I wish I could remember more exactly what it was. It might have been during I think it was during the Andover years, actually. But one of the things that I would say to that point, you know, Louisa May Alcott is often talked about as the first American writer who really sort of changed how we think about children, especially in Jo's Boys. I mean, you could certainly see it in Little Women, but I think especially it becomes very clear in Jo's Boys. But Stowe was already talking about the education of children as well as the education of girls in the story. I mean, one of the things I didn't even say in The Pearl of Orr's Island is that, so Mara, you know, they're trying to educate Moses because like Stowe herself with her brothers and everything, you know, it was the boys who got the education. But Mara would sort of hang out with her older brother, and she was the one who was absorbing everything and, you know, getting all the Greek and Latin. I think actually Emma in her paper actually talked about that a little bit, about the, you know, the education of girls. But I do think that I don't know whether Louisa May would have read Pearl's Orr's Island, but certainly she would have been influenced by Stowe's thinking. So.
We have a question from Brewster. You know, squeeze around here.
Hi, my name is Brewster Rhodes, and my mom, her grandfather, so my great-grandfather, who was born in the 1860s, had a cottage on Orr's Island. And she was born in 28, and she would spend summers. They would put her on the train with her sister in Philadelphia, and she would land somewhere up there and got met in Brunswick, and then would spend the entire summer at this cottage. And so we have old pictures. My wife has a bunch here, but it's fascinating. So we, I think, have pictures of each one of the shots you took, which is good. So I'm just curious about, Uncle Tom's Cabin came out before she went up there, right? And so she was very famous all over the United States, correct? The largest the most popular. Oh, she finished. Okay, fine. I'm just curious. How did the folks who lived there, the locals, so to speak, you touched on it in your presentation, though, react to her? What did they think of her being there for 2 years in their midst? How did they see her? I'm just curious.
So it's a good question to which I don't know the answer, so I'm therefore going to do the professorial thing and tell you a little bit about something that I actually do know for a second, which is that, this was Calvin's moment. Brunswick was Calvin's moment. It was for the first time, it was actually, they were struggling in Cincinnati, as you guys probably know. I mean, financially a great deal, even though I think the best way to describe them was genteel poor, right? They often got paid, the professors often got paid in potatoes and stuff, it wasn't easy for them, despite the fame of Lyman. And, so for Calvin as a biblical scholar, Bowdoin trained, he actually got his moment to come and be the professor. So, I don't know. I mean, I know that was that was the time during which Stowe entertained there was an enslaved person who she sort of helped, propel him further north as he stopped there at her home, right there at the campus. The home is the best home that they ever had. It's beautiful. I did take some pictures of that, but unfortunately I didn't get them into the slideshow. But they stopped at, so when she was quietly living in her home and her husband was sort of walking the 1 block or less over to the edge of Bowdoin College campus, I'm not sure. And I can only speculate, though, that since her book was coming out in 51 and 52, the same times exactly when she was still there, I almost think it was sort of like a natural thing to have this professor, this writer, this activist writer who was, writing while her professor husband was teaching at Bowdoin College. I will follow up, but I will don't know for sure the answer yet.
Any other questions? Well, let's give another round of applause to Dr. Reutter. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Reutter. And thank you to our wonderful audience, both here and online. We do have a full slate of lectures, discussion groups, and specialty tours for 2024. Due to our restoration work, our interior tours have paused for the remainder of this year, but will resume in February. And we are also increasing engagement and education throughout the community, so check out our website for program updates or to book a speaker. We'll hang out for a short while in the atrium for a more informal chat, and there might also be some snacks left out there. So thank you all, and have a great evening.